might think of Jerry Seinfeld as a comedian.
You look a little stressed.
Oh, I'm stressed.
He thinks of himself as a writer.
I wrote all my comedy. I wrote it.
At night, he performs to big crowds, but his days are spent in silence, alone, writing.
I like to write ideas out on paper. You will shave letters off of words. You count syllables, and they're all here. I saved it in this accordion folder. Every single thing.
Writing is the linchpin behind his success.
You have the #1 show on NBC.
Top-rated and most imitated comedy on television.
They offered me a lot of money to stay.
$110 million, I
Really?
heard. Yes. $110 million.
So how can you write like Jerry Seinfeld? Let's break it down. But first, why are we talking about a comedian here? Isn't this podcast about writing? Well, we all know that comedians are writers, but we don't think of them that way.
You make money during the day in comedy. What did you do today? And I said, yeah, we collect it at night, but we make it during the day. When I got the opportunity from NBC to do a series with Larry David, and he and I got together, we were ready to work. We knew what working was. We knew what writing was.
From walking around and thinking.
No, from writing.
But what's special about Seinfeld? It's that he loves to talk about the craft of writing. Most people who are as successful as he is, they don't like talking about how the sausage gets made. But Seinfeld loves it. And there's a lot that we can learn from him. When people think of a comedian, they think of the class clown. They think of your funny friend who's just cracking jokes at the bar. But Seinfeld's different. He's not really an improv guy. He's deliberate. And he refines and refines and refines his jokes until they're perfect. I think his mom called him Mr. Perfection, actually. And the vast majority of his work, of the process of making jokes really good, that happens in writing. But what stands out about Seinfeld is how obsessive he is about the craft, about this relentless march of improvement that you need to get good at whatever it is that you do. He did this interview with GQ magazine, and his very last answer, right at the bottom of the interview, gets at the core of what makes Seinfeld so good. Here's what he says. He goes, "There's nothing I revile quite as much as a dilettante. I don't like doing something to a mediocre level. It's great to be 70 years old because you really get to preach with some authority." And here's what he says. I want you to hear this. He goes, "Get good at something. That's it. Everything else is bullshit." Out of any comedian I've studied, I feel this deep connection with the way that Seinfeld talks about the craft. And obviously, he's been insanely successful. But how successful? Well, 10 Emmy Awards and 3 Golden Globes. His show has generated more than $3 billion in revenue. Netflix paid him $500 million for streaming rights to his show, and then they paid him another $100 million for rights to his Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee show, and along with that, 2 new stand-up specials. And then, according to some of the sources that I found in my internet sleuthing, Seinfeld's one of the few billionaire comedians out there. The guy did his very first comedy show almost 50 years ago. And in this episode, I want to answer the question of what has he learned during that time? And I'm going to share lessons with you about 2 things. 1, what has he learned about getting your writing done? And 2, what has he learned about making your writing good? So let's start with getting it done and the very first lesson, which is to embrace the difficulty of writing. That's what Seinfeld wants you to do, to embrace the difficulty of writing. The problem with writing isn't that it's hard. The problem is that people want it to be easy, so they run away when it gets difficult. And this is the first thing that you got to internalize, that writing is hard. It's hard. You just have to accept that if you're serious about pursuing this craft. It reminds me of how at the end of a lot of Tim Ferriss's podcast episodes, what he'll do is he'll ask guests to write on a billboard. And here's the prompt. He says, if you could spread a message to an entire city for them to see, what would you write on that billboard? So Seinfeld's being interviewed, and you know what he says?
I should have a giant flag behind me that I would pull a string and it would roll down, and on it, the flag would just say 2 words, just Work.
Just work.
2 words, just work. He says, the right way is the hard way. Here's another line I pulled from. He goes, people tell you to write like you can do it, like you're supposed to be able to do it. Nobody can do it. It's impossible. The greatest people in the world can't do it. And the point is that writing is incredibly hard. It just is. It's like running. It's like running. Running is always going to be difficult. Same with weight training, right? They're just difficult professions. We're just going to have to grind. You're going to have to push yourself. No one is ripped like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who never goes to the gym and just grunts and gets after it. But Seinfeld says that writing is harder than weight training. Way harder, because you're trying to create something when all you got in front of you is a blank white page. And that's hard. Seinfeld was talking about how his daughter is a writer now too. And there's one time where they're sitting down and she was all frustrated that writing was difficult. And Seinfeld goes, of course it is. Get over it. Writing is hard. You either want to write, you either want to be a writer, or you don't. But if you're expecting writing to just come easy, if you're expecting to just sit down and easily write something great, drop the pen, walk away from the keyboard, from the piece of paper, and just go do something else, if you think it's going to be like that, and then you're turned off, Seinfeld's like, look, you just don't want it bad enough. So that's the first lesson, that writing is hard. You have to internalize that, because that sets the context for the rest of the lessons that I'm going to share. The next one is, there's no such thing as writer's block. There's no such thing. He's like, doesn't exist. So what do? How do you actually sit down and get your writing done? Seinfeld says you gotta time box your writing practice. What does that mean? Well, Seinfeld's been writing for 50 years, right? And even people, greats like Jerry Seinfeld, who revere the craft of writing and know how core it is to their work, they have to develop ways to actually get themselves to the page when they don't feel like it. There's days when I want to write, but I don't feel like it. It happens to everybody. Actually, I've been reading East of Eden by John Steinbeck, and he wrote this book called The Journal of a Novel, where he talks about his writing process for the book. Same thing. He'll just have these journal entries, got nothing done today. Got nothing done today. But he sat down. He showed up that day and at least tried. And here's the thing. If you're going to be a writer, there's going to be days where you just don't feel like it. But that's why Seinfeld says you got a time box. So what does that mean? How do you push through and get yourself to write when you don't want to? And here's what Seinfeld says. He says, commit to a set writing time. What a lot of people do is they'll just give themselves an unlimited time to work on some open-ended problem. So they're like, I'm working on this thing in my writing. I'm trying to write this joke and I need to get it done today. And then all day you're like, I'm just not feeling it. You feel that resistance, right? Seinfeld says, nope, do the opposite. Say, I'm going to try to get this done in 30 minutes or an hour. And trainers know this, right? You go to the gym for a set amount of time and you show up and it sucks. I was talking to a friend over the weekend and he works with a trainer and I was saying, hey, what is it that you like about a trainer? And he goes, if I was at the gym by myself, I'd just get distracted. I'd get nothing done. He goes, I hate going to the gym. But the thing that helped me with the trainer is I know it's 60 minutes and I show up and I grunt and I'm like, I don't like this, but I know that once the clock hits the top of the hour, we're done. We're done. So I can get through the heavy weights. I can get through a bunch of reps. I can push through when I don't feel like it because I know that this is time boxed. Writing's the same way. Set yourself a time limit. You can say an hour. I can do that. Okay, an hour is too long. How about 30 minutes? How about 15? You can do 15 minutes, Seinfeld says. You can do 15 minutes. And once again, Seinfeld said to his daughter, he's sort of consoling her as she's working through the arduous struggles that we face as a writer. And he goes, you have to have an end time to your writing session. If you're going to sit down at a desk with a problem and do nothing else, you've got to get a reward for that. And the reward is this. The alarm goes off and you're done. You walk up, You walk away and you go have some cookies and milk. You're done. And that leads me to Seinfeld's actual writing process. It's simple. It's really simple. It's just this: full focus, no distractions, do it every day. Full focus, no distractions, do it every day. But you can't do anything else. You don't have to write when you're sitting there, but you can't do anything else. There's none of this getting distracted on Twitter, none of this checking texts, going to some website that you use to distract yourself, reading the news, checking ESPN, going to your favorite blog. No, you got to cut that out. One of the things I've started doing is I work in this room at my office, and 2 rooms over in the studio where we record the episodes, I keep my phone there plugged in. So I literally got to walk like 20 seconds just to go get my phone. It's helped so much. But that full focus, no distractions, do it every day, that process for Seinfeld basically hasn't changed in 5 decades. He sits with the same yellow legal pad and he writes. And because that he just doesn't believe in writer's block. He won't even entertain the idea of writer's block. He goes, just sit down, get a piece of paper, and just be focused then. You can be lazy, you can be scared, you can be a crummy writer, but there is no writer's block, okay? That's what he says. Then he says, don't break the chain. Don't break the chain. I actually think this was the very first writing lesson I learned from Jerry Seinfeld. And the story goes like this. Many years ago, Seinfeld's at a theater and he meets this young comedian. The guy's name is Brad Isaac, who's just kind of getting started in his comedy career, and he meets Jerry Seinfeld. So naturally, he asks, hey, Jerry, you got any tips for a young comic? And the answer applies for writers too. Seinfeld says that the best way to be successful is to write better jokes. Okay, obviously. But this is where it gets interesting. And the best way to write better jokes is to write every day. So Seinfeld tells the young comic to get a big old wall calendar that has a whole year on one page. You got this giant calendar. You just hang it on a prominent wall inside your house, inside your office. And then you get a big old fat red marker. And for every single day that you get your writing done, you get to put a big old X over that day. And here's what Seinfeld said. After a few days of writing, you'll have a chain. Keep at it, and the chain will grow longer every day. You'll like seeing that chain, especially when you get a few weeks under your belt. And your only job is not to break the chain. So the chain is all the X's that you're writing when you get your work done. March 22nd, X. March 23rd, X. March 24th, X, 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 X. And that consistency, that's what gets you to improve your writing. And James Clear made a good observation about this. And it's that Seinfeld did not give him advice about what words to use or how to actually write. It didn't say anything about results. All that mattered was showing up consistently and not breaking the chain. Which leads me to the next lesson. Distraction is the enemy. Distraction is the enemy. And there's 2 kinds of distractions, okay? Sometimes the distractions that come with being a writer, they show up when you're actually writing. We were talking about this before, right? Checking emails, scrolling some stupid social media feed. Somebody's trying to get your attention. There's emails coming in. One of the things that I struggle with is like, I call this checking, where like, I'm going to check to see if there's any good tweets recently. Hey, has anybody texted me? Hey, has anyone sent me a Slack message? Hey, how about my email? How about WhatsApp? And I'm just looking for the next dopamine hit. I do it all the time. It's checking. And then I'll like go around the circle of checking and then I'll go back and do it again. It's ridiculous. You gotta avoid this. You gotta avoid this. That's what we've been talking about. That sort of checking, that is the distraction that happens when you're writing. You gotta avoid that. But then there's bigger distractions to avoid. And these become really prominent as you become more successful. And these big distractions, this is the scene. These are the parties. These are different media events. And what you see all the time is people who become successful by writing or by making films. And then once they get successful, they get really into the scene. They get swept into the glitz and the glam. And then they stop doing the thing that made them successful in the first place. And yes, avoiding this stuff is going to take work. It means they're going to have to say no to a lot of other things that aren't the writing. And one of the hardest parts of getting that early success is not being distracted by those big things so that you can do the work that you're actually supposed to be doing. That also means just saying no to all the admin work that inevitably comes up when you're working on something. Those speaking opportunities, the schmoozing that famous people get into, it can be a full-time distraction. And all of a sudden, you've gotten away from that work that made you successful in the first place. You got to avoid these distractions if you're going to sustain the excellence. But it looks like Seinfeld never really let that happen. One of the things I respect most about him. And he says that most TV shows, the writers, they'll spend roughly half their time working on the show, doing the writing. That's great. But then they'll spend the other half dealing with people and personalities and political dramas and all sorts of issues that come up whenever you try to do something hard. But Seinfeld and Larry David, who co-wrote Seinfeld with him, they spent 99% of their time writing. Just the two of them. Door closed, no distractions. They wanted to ignore the outside world so that they could focus on the show because the work is what mattered. And this leads me to what might be my favorite anecdote, and I'm going to read you the whole thing because it's so dang good. So this is from an interview that Jerry Seinfeld did with the Harvard Business Review. And I don't know if this is true, but you can kind of imagine the interview. And here's how I like to think about it. I like to think of it taking place in this stuffy boardroom with people who are taking themselves all seriously, right? And here's how the interview goes. So here's the Harvard Business Review people talking. They go like this. You and Larry David wrote Seinfeld together without a traditional writer's room, and burnout was one reason you stopped. Was there a more sustainable way to do it? Could McKinsey or someone have helped you find a better model? Seinfeld goes, who's McKinsey? Then the Harvard Business Review people go, it's a consulting firm. Seinfeld goes, are they funny? The HBR people go, no. And this is where Seinfeld just lets it rip. He goes, then I don't need them. If you're efficient, you're doing it the wrong way. The right way is the hard way. The show was successful because I micromanaged it. Every word, every line, every take, every edit, every casting. That's my way of life. That's so hardcore. And that is who Seinfeld is. He's like, what's going on there, right? He's like, are they funny? That's the thing that matters. That's the thing we're going for. We're not trying to be efficient here. He goes, the right way is the hard way. And I'm going to micromanage everything, every word, every line, every edit, every casting. That's my way of life. I'm going to get my hands in the clay and I'm going to shape the heck out of this thing. And if it means that burnout comes from it, if it means I'm exhausted, I'm putting 14, 16-hour days in, then fine, so be it. But I'm going to do great work. The next lesson is to fail doing exactly what you want to do. When you're creative, you need to think about what projects am I going to pursue? There's a bunch of options, but you can only really do one or two things well at any given time, right? And if you look at Seinfeld's career, he thinks of himself like a stand-up comedian. But he's done the TV show Seinfeld. He's done a talk show called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And then he recently did a movie about Pop-Tarts. And as he was thinking about doing the movie, he was a little bit nervous. He hasn't made as many movies and he's afraid of failure at this time. And he runs into a comedy legend at a party. And he tells this story. I can't tell the story better than he can. He tells this story in a killer interview with Neil Brennan. Here's what he says.
Dave Letterman, I have to say, I told him I'm writing this pilot for NBC. It was one of his year-end Christmas parties or something. Mm-hmm. He said, just make sure you fail doing exactly what you want to do. He told me that. And that's the best advice you can give someone going into a big, scary project. Make sure you fail doing it exactly the way you want it. Because that you can live with.
Yes.
That you can live with. When it's someone else's idea that kills you, that's hard to live with.
Yeah, you'll be homicidal.
Hold on. Stop the podcast because this was the clip that made me want to do this episode. This hit me hard. This hit me really hard because when you're creative and you're serious about your work, you're going to have a vision, not just for what you want to achieve, but how you want to do things. And if you're not careful, the world will suck the oxygen out of your individuality. It'll take your voice and it'll just squash it. Maybe it's an editor who says, nope, I don't want you to write like that. I know that's how you usually write, but that writing like that's not going to sell books. And a lot of times when you want to follow your heart, but you're afraid to do that, it's because you're afraid to fail. You're afraid of what's going to happen. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of looking bad in front of a big audience, whatever it is, fear of not doing things the right way. This has happened to me a trillion times. And when I think of my own regrets, a lot of times it comes back to not doing things in a way that was true to me. And this clip hit me hard because when you give yourself the permission to fail like this and you really listen to what Dave Letterman's trying to communicate here and you lean into that failure, there's this strange way that the fear of failure just goes away. And it allows you to focus on your creative expression. I have a friend who he was running, is a mentor, and he was running a big company in the 90s. And he was the CEO. They brought in it was a CFO or something to basically temper him because he was a super intense CEO. And they said, you're intense, we'll bring in the CFO and there'll be a good balance. And it wasn't working super well. Somebody then who was on this guy's executive team said, hey, you're thinking about this the wrong way. We're thinking about this the wrong way. People are here to work for you, the CEO. They came here to work for you, and they would rather be on your boat doing things how you want to do it with your creative vision, and they would rather row that boat off the cliff than to be in a boat in still water, something that feels safe but not go anywhere. People are here for you to follow your vision. And that day, maybe a week later, he let go of that CFO and he said, you know what? You're right. We're going to do things my way. We're going to follow my vision. And if it means that we fail, that's fine. And I want you to listen closely here. The percent chance of failure might go up, but the chance that you have regret will go down because you've accepted failure from the beginning and you've said, I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to compromise. So that ends the first section. That's how you get it done. We've talked about embracing the difficulty. We've talked about how there's no such thing as writer's block. You got a time box. Then we spoke about don't break the chain, how distraction is the enemy, and how you want to fail doing what you want to do. And now I want to break down a piece of Seinfeld's writing for you. This is an intro from a New York Times op-ed that he wrote. We're going to break it down, talk about what makes it so good, and then we'll get back to the second half of the episode. Here we go. When I got my first apartment in Manhattan in the hot summer of 1976, there was no pooper scooper law, and the streets were covered in dog crap. I signed the rental agreement, walked outside, and my car had been towed. I still thought, this is the greatest place I've ever been in my life. Okay, this introduction is an odyssey. Remember the context here. This is the New York Times. And when you open up a New York Times article, you expect it to be serious. But here, Jerry Seinfeld is the author, and he's like, nah, I'm a comedian. This introduction is both funny and captivating because of the way that every sentence just ping-pongs between emotions. So check this out. He goes, when I got my first apartment in Manhattan in the hot summer of 1976, I'm thinking blue skies, I'm thinking parades, I'm thinking all the good stuff. But now, dun-dun-dun-dun, he goes, there was no pooper scooper law, and the streets were covered in dog crap. So now we've gone from good to bad, from green to red. But then things get good again, right? He goes, I signed the rental agreement, walked outside, and at this point you're thinking, oh my goodness, we're about to get the greatest thing to happen. New York City, summertime. And he goes, my car had been towed. So now, high, low, high, low. And then what happens? He ends with the high. He says, this is the greatest place I've ever been in my life. Now, if you wrote an entire piece like this, it'd be exhausting. It wouldn't work, but it works well for an intro. This opener is only 2 sentences long, and that's all that it takes for Seinfeld to break the frame of a New York Times article, to create tension, to release it, and then make the reader laugh not once, but twice. It's an odyssey, it's a roller coaster, and it's a series of setting expectations and immediately breaking them. So hey, there's a look at how Seinfeld does his thing. And look, I do one of those every single week. So if you want me to send it to you, go to writingexamples.com and enter your email. Now, let's get back to the episode. Now I want to move into the second half of this, which is how do you make your writing good? And the first principle here is that the work never stops. The work never stops. So I'll start with a story. I have a comedian friend in town, and I said, you know what? His name's Reza Jaffer. I said, you know what, Reza, it'd be fun to go to the symphony together. I just thought that pairing a hoity-toity fancy symphony with a comedian would be really funny. So we get all dressed up and we show up early, we get some drinks beforehand, and we're just hanging out in the theater before the show starts. And we're looking around, and the median age of the people in this theater must have been 70 years old. So we're cracking jokes, we're talking about the aesthetic of the place, the vibe, the different people, who knows what. But we're like two 10-year-old boys just cracking jokes. But I don't know what it was, but my friend said something, and we're 10 minutes into sitting there, and we are laughing so hard. It is like that kind of laughter, it's belly laughter, where it hurts your abs to be laughing so hard. And we're going back and forth. We're just sort of working on the bit. He's making most of the jokes, but all of a sudden, I couldn't believe it. He pulls out a notebook from his back pocket, and I'm like, Reza, why do you have this notebook? The guy starts drawing 2x2 axes like he's working for McKinsey or something, breaking down his joke. I'm like, what are you doing? And he's getting everything on paper, and he goes, when I find a joke like that, that's that funny, what I try to do is I try to get as much out as fast as possible while it's still fresh. And here's what stuck with me there. What he did was he switched from a right brain and intuitive mode into a left brain and analytical one instantly. Instantly. Because when you have new ideas, it'll come from that intuitive place. They'll just come out. But if you can learn to recognize that you found a good joke, a good piece of writing, a good idea, that then is when you can switch into that analytical state and try to figure out what is it about this joke, this idea that's making it work. And I want to share with you this clip from Seinfeld's interview with Howard Stern. And what I want you to listen for is this idea of look for the torture that you're comfortable with. Look for the torture that you're comfortable with.
You went to a Chinese restaurant. And you're like, I really admire Chinese people because they're really sticking to this chopsticks thing.
The line is, I like how they're hanging in there with the chopsticks.
Right. Because they've seen the fork. They've seen the fork.
Yeah, we've got it, you beat.
Yeah.
But they're going, no.
To me, this is a brilliant observation.
Thank you.
Yes. Now, when you had that observation, were you sitting at a Chinese restaurant, and can you go to a Chinese restaurant and not sit there and work on material?
I'm never not working on material.
So
ever.
even when you're sitting with your wife, you're sitting with the kids, it's material.
Every second of my existence, I'm thinking, could I do something with that?
It sounds like a tortured life. And you say it's not.
It is. But you know what? Your blessing in life is when you find the torture you're comfortable with.
See, that's what I mean. The work never stops. Whenever you're talking about ideas, you're getting feedback on which ones are good or bad. If I'm talking to someone, I can see in their eyes, I can see in their body language if what I'm saying is interesting or if I've gone too far. It's the same thing with comedy, right? I'm sitting with my friend, we're cracking a bunch of jokes, all of a sudden both of us have a belly laugh, and that means we've stumbled on something good. And no, you're not going to be like a stand-up comedian. Like, you're not going to get on stage in front of a bunch of different people, but you are always getting that feedback in the form of conversations at lunch and dinners and with a water cooler at work or coffee chats with friends, whatever it is, you're on a walk with somebody, you're always getting that feedback. And when I talk about the work never stopping, pay attention to how people are reacting to what you're saying. Which leads me to the next lesson of talk through your ideas and get feedback. Talk through your ideas and get feedback. I call this writing from conversation. And for Seinfeld, the writing process, it begins away from the page. It begins in conversations with other comedians. And the lesson that I want to get across here is that it's hard for you to know if your ideas are worthy. We're talking about it earlier with Don't Break the Chain, right? Seinfeld did not focus on the results. He said the best way to have better ideas is just to produce more of them. And the best way to produce more of them is to commit to writing every day. And then you get the big old red X. As a creator, it's your job to come up with a bunch of ideas. Then it's the audience's job to respond to them. And as the creator, you're just listening to their reactions. And then you're doubling down on the stuff with the very best potential. I was at a party a few weeks ago, and this guy comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, David, love your stuff. And I'm really new to writing, but I'm struggling to get started because I don't feel like my ideas are any good." So I go, "Okay, how often are you writing?" And he goes, "Well, I'm not putting pen to paper because I don't have good ideas." And I go, "You're not writing at all?" He goes, "Yeah, I'm not going to write until I have a good idea." And I just look at him and I say, "You have everything backwards. You need to write consistently, day in and day out, day in and day out. And at first, your stuff might not even be that good. But what you need to do is put in the reps of consistency. And if you do that, that's going to get you to good ideas way faster than sitting down on some chair and just stroking your beard all day, waiting for some idea to come." It reminds me of Seinfeld's book. It's called Is This Anything? And it's called that because Is This Anything is something that comedians say to each other all the time after testing out a new bit. A lot of what you're doing in writing and comedy is you're putting things out in the world to see what lands. You're just throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And comedians have an advantage of that instantaneous feedback. I'll 100% admit it. But they pay for it with the horror of having to go on stage and test out their jokes. The advantage for them is instant feedback. They're on stage and they immediately know if something is good or terrible based on the audience's reactions. If there's no laughter, your joke isn't any good. But what they can do is they can take that data and then they can let it inform the next iteration of a joke. So something you see all the time is that comedians will play around with tempo. They'll play around with word choice. And for whatever reason, if you wait 1 second longer there, or you change a word from take a sip to take a swig, now swig is way funnier than sip, and that joke is going to resonate way more. So what does this look like in practice? Well, I want to show you with this short clip from a talk that I gave at the Main Street Summit. The example I use here is from Chris Rock, but it applies to Jerry Seinfeld's comedy too. And if you're listening, this is a good time to open the video.
How does Chris Rock refine his ideas? How does he do it? How does he do it? How does he do it? So what he does is he starts off in those small comedy clubs and he'll throw out a set. And he'll get to the end of the first set and be like, all right, purple stuff, not that good. But you know what? Honestly, people laugh pretty hard for the two green things. Okay, so I'm going to keep those green stories. Those are my jokes. And now I'm going to go for set 2. Throw them at the front. Bunch of new material. Okay, so we'll try this new material. Let's take a look at it after. All right, the green stuff we like. The purple stuff we don't like. Let's let go of the purple stuff. The green stuff, it's not perfect, but it definitely has potential. And you do that over and over and over and over again, right? And then eventually, now we're at Madison Square Garden. Now it's game day, baby. Now it's the Netflix special. And now you get all green. So when you watch Chris Rock, you're like, how does he do all green? It's because you're not seeing all this work that went into it. That's the magic. That's the juice. That's what it means to write from conversation. That's what it means to make writing social.
So you see that clip and you think to yourself, but David, I'm a writer. I don't have an audience that I get to talk to. What do I do? And this is what I call writing from conversation, and it is the essence of what we teach at Write a Passage. The reason that we get hundreds of people together in a cohort is so that we can write from conversation just like comedians do. And what we say to every student is we say, talk about your ideas with people. See what interests them. Look for the things that get their eyes to light up. Look for the things that, hey, maybe they're bored about. But the audience is always going to give you feedback. And there's 3 things that you can look for. You can look for what's interesting, double down on those ideas. You can look for what's confusing, rewrite those ideas. And you can look for what's boring. What is not really getting people to engage, and just cut those ideas. And now if you're thinking, but David, I need to keep the ideas because I don't have enough ideas. Well, that goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier. Then you just need to write more. If something is boring, it doesn't have that potential, just cut it. Just cut it. You don't need it. Just go out and make more material. So the question is, how do you do that? And that leads me to the next principle. Don't write and edit at the same time. Don't write and edit at the same time.
The key to writing, to being a good writer, is to treat yourself like a baby, very extremely nurturing and loving, and then switch over to Lou Gossett in Officer and a Gentleman. And just be a harsh prick, ball-busting son of a bitch about that is just not good enough. That's got to come out, or it's got to be redone or thrown away. So flipping back and forth between those 2 brain quadrants is the key to writing.
So 2 phases. There's the baby phase, and this is that free play creative phase. This is when you're messing around with whatever idea pops into your head, nurture, love, support, the kumbaya vibes. And in this baby phase, you're just not paying a lot of attention to how good the ideas are. You're letting them flow. You're following the intuitive flow of that moment. You're not analyzing what you're creating. Hey, is this good? Is this going to be worthy of publishing? Just make stuff, just write, just get stuff down on paper. That's the baby phase. But then there's the officer phase. This is polish and construction, refining and perfecting every single word. This is when your analytical mind is active. Your standards are high. This is the time to be strict. This is when you're ready to be critical. You're red penning the heck out of your work. You're asking questions like, how do I make this better? Is this worthy? How can I improve the structure of this story? This sentence is bothering me. This word is not the right word. Now we gotta find what's gonna make it excellent. So there's the baby phase, there's the officer phase, and you can't get them mixed. You can't get them mixed. So here's my recommendation. Whenever you sit down to write, think to yourself, what phase am I in now? Am I in the baby phase or the officer phase for this time being? Choose one and just live inside that phase. One of the things that I do is I have different places and different times a day where I enter these phases. I try to just keep them separate and distinct. When I sit at this desk, I'm creating. In the mornings, I'm creating. That's the baby phase. When I sit on the couch in the other room, that's when I'm editing. Towards the end of the day, maybe at night, a weekend, that's when I like to edit. Things are a little bit slower. I can take some time. I even have less caffeine in my system. Editing is crucial, don't get me wrong, but it's got to come later. And editing is so crucial, not just in writing, but for Seinfeld's show, his talk show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, he would produce an original edit of that'd be something like 3.5 hours long. And then he would cut the episode down to 20 minutes or so. Bunch of editing, bunch of editing, bunch of editing. That is how the creative process functions all the time when you study these greats. From editing, I want to give you one final point about making it good. And that's not everybody's going to like what you write. And that's the point. Got a text yesterday. Friend had writer's block. I was trying to help him out. What's going on? Why is he struggling? And it came down to this. The reason that he had writer's block is because he had the voice of 1,000 critical readers in his head as he was trying to write. And that just suffocates the oxygen out of your creative spirit. Seinfeld says, nope, you cannot do that, because the easiest way to crush your creative spirit as a writer is to insist on making something that everybody likes. With the Whole Earth catalog, Stuart Brand and Kevin Kelly, they wanted to offend 1/5 of the audience because they said that if we're not offending 1/5 of our audience, making them angry in some capacity, we're probably not being truly honest as writers. I love that. And Seinfeld takes it a step further than even I'm comfortable with. He actually reads the bad reviews. He thinks they're funny. And he's in this interview with Barry Weiss, and she challenges him on this. And here's how it went down.
Okay, but you actually will read bad reviews.
Oh, yeah.
Really?
They're funny.
Have you always been like that?
Yes, it doesn't matter what you think of me. Why would I think that I'm going to make something that everyone will like? What sense does that make?
Okay, but
you got to be insane to think that.
Man, that is so liberating. That is so liberating, because when you can accept the idea that not everybody is going to resonate with what you're saying, but you have this inner conviction that what you're doing is of quality, or that it's true, that it's this sincere expression of what you need to say, that's when you can enter a creative flow. That's when you can enter that divine state where you're kind of unconscious as a creator. But the second that you're trying to make something that everybody likes, you get stifled. There is no creative expression that can flow when you are trapped by the judgmental eye of your audience. When that's top of mind as you're creating, nope, can't do it. Actually, here's a little how I write story. So if you go back and you listen to the Jason Fried episode that I recorded, and you listen to that, you'll notice that there's about a 25-minute segment where we break down his writing process for these founder letters. And it is my favorite part of the episode. But we actually thought about removing it. We thought it might be too geeky for what most How I Write listeners would want. And we're sitting there, we're having this conversation, and I have this realization. And I say exactly this. I go, if somebody doesn't like How I Write because we geek out too hard on the writing process, it's just too obsessive about the craft, we're doing something right. My goal in creating this show and creating How I Write is to make something that most people don't like, so that you wackos who are obsessed with writing, who want to learn all about the creative process, that you can have something that you adore and that you can't get anywhere else. And the cost of that is that most people aren't going to like How I Write, and I'm totally down with that. Seinfeld's got good stuff on endings too. At a macro level, I want to show you a chart. What are we looking at here? These are season by season ratings for popular TV shows. You'll see that The Simpsons and Family Guy and 2.5 Men, they get bad reviews at the end. At the beginning, the seasons were pretty good, but they just dragged it on too long, and all of a sudden, people didn't like it that much anymore. But Seinfeld refused to let that happen. His show is the only one on TV where the last season ended up in the top 20% of IMDb ratings after going 9 years or more. The only one. NBC offered Seinfeld $110 million to do a 10th season of the show, and Seinfeld said nope. He didn't want the show to wither. He wanted to end it on a high. Because here's what he says: a small amount of too much changes the whole feeling about it. I wanted to end the show with a feeling of it was never bad.
Warren Littlefield wrote that if you would have given him another season of Seinfeld, he would have paid you $110 million for the year. $110 million.
I could have got more than that. It's a small amount of too much cake, too much anything,
but do you think
and changes the whole feeling about. So we had this wonderful, intense love affair.
Right.
The people are making the show and the audience. And I wanted it to end with a fireworks burst of it never was bad.
At a micro level, Seinfeld talks about dosage, this concept of dosage, where he says a good writer or comedian, you leave the audience wanting more. You know, the best comedian in the world, Seinfeld, Louis C.K., whoever it is. And a comedian can leave everybody happy with 70 minutes of content, but all of a sudden you stretch it out to 90 and the audience says, meh, that was fine. You just went from 70 to 90 and it goes from wow to meh, whatever. And this notion of restricting supply to only what is excellent, to only the length of time that's going to keep the audience's attention, this applies to every creative medium. Every piece of writing that you're working on, it'll apply to that. Notice, this isn't about being short. This isn't about, hey, we're only going to do TikToks, YouTube shorts now. Not at all. If that's what you're thinking, you're missing the point. This is just about saying, what is the right amount of dosage for this? And never letting people get bored. And that's where I'm going to end this show here. That's the episode. I'm just going to do a quick review of what we covered. Then we're done. What are the main lessons? Part 1, getting it done. Embrace the difficulty. There's no such thing as writer's block. So time box, don't break the chain, don't get distracted, and fail doing what you want to do. And then we talked about making it good. Be obsessed with the craft. The work never stops. Talk through your ideas and get feedback. Then don't write and edit at the same time. Finally, not everybody's going to like it, and that's the point. And remember, dosage.